Hi everyone, I'm Jacob Lackner, and it's Thursday, so that means it's time for another history video. As always, I ran a poll last week to let you, the viewers, vote on what this week's topic would be, and it was a close one. But in the end, people most wanted to see me talk about Jewish resistance to the Rhineland massacres of 1096, so that's what I'll be talking about today. This video has two main parts. First, I'm going to talk about what led to these massacres and their general background, and second, I'm going to talk about the various ways that Jews resisted them, talking about three main types of responses that Jews had during the massacres, and we're going to look at some primary sources in that part of the discussion. So let's start by looking at what led to these massacres. So it all begins in 1095, when Pope Urban II presided over the Council of Clermont in southern France. This conference was primarily called for because the Byzantine Empire had lost several battles in a row to Seljuk Turks, a rising power in the Levant and elsewhere. He sent a delegation to ask the Pope for his help, and Urban responded by ultimately calling for the First Crusade at the council in December of 1095. The crusade ultimately culminated with Western Christians conquering a bunch of territory in the east, including conquering Jerusalem in 1099, and this led to the establishment of several Crusader states. But that part of the crusade isn't really our focus here. We're going to look at what some Crusaders did in Europe itself as they were headed to Constantinople, which was the meeting point for all the different crusading armies. Urban's speech called for a fairly organized armed pilgrimage to the east, and several very high-ranking nobles would lead the crusade. There was even a date set when everyone was supposed to head out before meeting up in Constantinople, and that was August of 1096. However, Urban's speech had some unintended consequences. His speech casts Muslims as monolithic enemies of Christianity who were killing Christians in the east because they were Christians, which wasn't really a reflection of reality. But Urban didn't mention Jews at all in his speech. But that kind of rhetoric ended up stirring up some religious fanaticism in Europe that ultimately resulted in some more ragtag groups of crusaders attacking cities in Central Europe with large Jewish populations, where they either outright killed them or gave them convert or die ultimatums. These groups of crusaders were led by religious fanatics. One of them was Peter the Hermit, who, as you can guess from his name, was, well, a hermit. And he wasn't someone the church approved to preach the crusade, but he did it anyway. And his charisma gained him a following. So he decided to set out for Constantinople with this ragtag group, which had very few people with any actual fighting experience. Peter was not a good leader, who was unable to control his men, who did a lot of looting and pillaging and targeted Jews especially. Another charismatic preacher named Folkmar, who lived in Saxony, was more direct in his desire to attack Jews, and once he gained a following, he decided to have his crusade attack Jews in both Prague and Bohemia. However, there is one crusade leader in particular that this video really focuses on, and he's the one who directed the most sustained attacks against Jews in the Rhineland. His name was Emico, and he was the Count of Floheim. His religious fanaticism was so extreme that rather than simply put a cross on his clothing, as most crusaders did, he is said to have physically carved one into his own forehead. That gives you some idea of where he was coming from. Emico was a minor lord, but he managed to gain a following of around 10,000, and unlike Peter's crusade, which doesn't seem to have gone out of its way to attack Jews, Emico's crusade did. His reasoning was that he wanted to get rid of enemies of Christianity at home before going after the ones abroad. This is actually a watershed event in Jewish-Christian relations, because before this, things had largely been fairly peaceful and non-violent between the two groups, and in a lot of ways this was the beginning of anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages. If you want to know more about this event's place in the history of anti-Semitism, I did do a whole video on medieval anti-Semitism that you should check out. For this video, we're going to focus on the actions of Jews during these massacres led by Emico. In the end, this event would be catastrophic for the Jewish community. It's hard to know exactly how many Jews were killed, as medieval chroniclers are notorious for inflating numbers, but at the very least, several thousand Jews died during the events of the Rhineland massacres. These events were so catastrophic to Jews that they did something they hadn't done much of in the Middle Ages. They started recording history, and several chronicles were produced detailing the events of these massacres. It is worth noting that these chronicles were all composed after the event, and their usefulness as a record of what actually happened has been called into question by some historians who have argued that they served as a polemical text that helped Jews stay strong in the face of anti-Semitism. However, even if that is the case, the way that Jews are depicted as resisting conversion is still important in studying these events. It should be noted that the main thing the Jews in these chronicles are trying to prevent is their conversion. They see their own death as much less of an issue, as they would rather die than allow themselves to be forcibly converted. That is the result of a Jewish belief that it's better to die than commit certain transgressions against Judaism, and conversion to Christianity was viewed as one of these transgressions. Sometimes it was enough to just refuse the convert or die ultimatum, and the Crusaders would kill those who refused, but that didn't always work. Even if one did everything they could and refused conversion, sometimes the Crusaders would physically force them to the church to be baptized, even against their will, and this was the thing that Jews wanted to avoid most of all. So, in these chronicles, there are three very active forms of Jewish resistance to forced conversion. One of these is taking their own lives, another is goading the Christians into killing them, and the last one is openly violent resistance. These methods were all successful ways to avoid yourself being forcibly converted. Additionally, even though these methods all seem significantly different, those who did these things are all praised as having done Kiddush Hashem, which literally translates as sanctifying the divine name, and can fairly accurately be translated as martyrdom. In other words, these people, despite the different ways they died, are all viewed as heroes by the chroniclers. The more traditional definition of martyr is generally that someone is passive and refuses to convert and allows themselves to be killed or executed by their persecutors. But that's not the definition that's used in these chronicles. Anyone who died resisting conversion, no matter how they did it, is a martyr. So from here, I'm going to give you an example of each one of these ways to resist conversion, so you can get an idea for how Jews responded to this horrible event. So let's begin with Jews who chose to take their own lives rather than allow themselves to be either forcibly converted or killed by the Christians who were attacking their city. Some of the more notable examples of this involve Jewish women who also chose to slay their children before killing themselves rather than allow themselves or their children to be converted. The women in the Chronicles who take this action are compared to priests who made sacrifices to God during the time when the temple stood, with them and their children being the sacrifices that are being made. Some references are also made to Abraham and Isaac. The example I'm going to give you here comes from the Chronicle of Solomon bar Simson, and it involves a woman named Rachel and her children. Rachel was a resident of Mainz, and the bishop, in response to the Crusaders' coming, hid her children, and some other women in a room in his palace. However, it eventually becomes clear that the Crusaders have discovered their location, and as they are trying to break down the door, here's what Solomon's Chronicle relates. Rachel said the following: "I have 4 children. We shall have no mercy on them, lest those uncircumcised ones come and seize them alive and raise them in error. My children shall sanctify the name of God." One of her friends came and took the knife to slaughter her sons. When the mother, Rachel, saw the knife, she cried loudly and bitterly and smote her face and breast, crying, "Where is your grace, O Lord?" Then her friends slaughtered her 2 sons, Isaac and Aaron. She had 2 daughters left, named Bella and Madrona, modest and beautiful maidens. The maidens themselves took the knife and sharpened it. They extended their necks to their mother, and the mother sacrificed them to the Lord, God of hosts, who commanded us not to depart from his pure doctrine and to remain wholehearted to him. After this, she tried to take her own life, but the Crusaders make it into the room with her and kill her first. This excerpt shows you a lot about how far the Jews of Rhineland are willing to go to avoid their own conversion or the conversion of their children. Rachel clearly views conversion as the greater evil and would rather kill her own children and herself than allow it to happen. The next type of response that I want to talk about are Jews who chose to antagonize the Crusaders, goading them into killing them. One can imagine that this course of action might have been satisfying, as basically talking trash to the people who were trying to kill and or forcibly convert you probably felt somewhat cathartic. It was also an effective way to make sure that you wouldn't be dragged to the baptismal font and forcibly converted, because if you made people mad enough, they would just kill you. In other words, if you didn't want to be forcibly converted, but you also weren't able to take your own life for some reason, this was a path you could take. The example of this type of action that I'll be utilizing also comes from the Chronicle of Solomon bar Simson. In this excerpt, David ben Nathaniel of Worms and his family are slain by the Crusaders. David is the Gabai of Worms, someone of high standing who helped with the running of the synagogue, with Deacon, perhaps the best Christian analog. At the point we're picking up this story, almost all of the Jews of Worms have been killed, converted, or fled, and David and his family are hiding in a courtyard when the Crusaders find them. A priest approaches them and tells them that to save themselves, they'll have to convert. According to Solomon Bar Simson, here's what happened after that. David replied, "Go tell the others, in my name, to come to me." When the priest heard the words of this saintly man, he rejoiced greatly, for he thought, "Such a distinguished Jew has consented to give heed to our words." He ran to those outside the courtyard and related the words of the righteous man who had sent him. The others too rejoiced greatly, and gathered around the house by the thousands. When the righteous man saw them, he placed his trust in the God of his fathers, and called out to them, saying, "You are children of whoredom, believing as you do in a God who was a bastard that was crucified. As for me, I believe in the everlasting God who dwells in the lofty heavens. In him have I trusted to this day, and I will continue to do so until my soul departs. Moreover, I know the truth. If you slay me, my soul will abide in the Garden of Eden, in the light of life. Moreover, I know the truth. If you slay me, my soul will abide in the Garden of Eden, in the light of life. You, however, will descend to the deep pit, to eternal obloquy. To Gehinnom are you and your whoreson God condemned, and to boiling excrement will you be consigned." So David's reaction to what was likely imminent death was an interesting one. He decided to trick the Crusaders into thinking he and his family would convert, so that they would all gather around his house. At this point, there wasn't really anything else for the Crusaders to do, and he knew that he would have a large audience. However, once they were gathered there, he ripped into the Crusaders and their religion, telling them they are errant in their beliefs, and even going so far as to directly attack Jesus, who he describes as the son of a whore and a bastard. He wraps it all up by basically saying, "Go ahead and kill me and my family. We'll go to heaven. When you guys die, you're all going to hell. And it's not just any hell. They'll be trapped in boiling excrement for all of eternity, which is a pretty terrible fate." This might seem reckless on the part of David, that he would decide to antagonize the Crusaders and get his entire family killed, but for him, this was the preferable fate. He and his family would either have been outright killed by the Crusaders for refusing to convert, or physically dragged to the church to be forcibly baptized. At least this way, he kind of gets the last word before the Crusaders kill them all. The Chronicle lauds the actions of David and even says that he and his family have sanctified the divine name, assigning them status as martyrs. Lastly, I want to talk about another kind of response that is rarer than the first two we've talked about, but it was one that is present intermittently throughout the Chronicles, and this is Jews who decided their best course of action was to take up arms and attempt to fight off the Crusaders. If you were a Jew trying to resist forced conversion, this course of action makes some sense, because if you succeeded in fighting them off, you don't have to worry about dying, but if you die trying to fight them off, you still avoid forced conversion. The Jews who take this course of action are cast as heroic fighters and compared to biblical warriors like Joshua, and they're still assigned martyrdom status. Here's an example of this type of response as it appears in the Chronicle of the Minds Anonymous. It involves a Jew in the city of Worms. There was another man there, Simcha HaKohen, who was the son of Isaac HaKohen, and they sought to baptize him. They said to him, "Look, the other crusaders have all been killed," to which the clever youth responded, "I will do all you ask of me if you take me to the bishop." They agreed and took him to the bishop's courtyard. The bishop's nephew was there too, and his captors left him there in the courtyard with the bishop, his nephew, and some attendants. Once they left, the youth drew his knife and gnashed his teeth like a lion hunting his prey. He dashed at the bishop's kinsman and plunged the knife into his belly, killing him. Then he stabbed and killed another two before the knife broke in his hand. They had fled in all directions, but once they saw that the knife was broken, they attacked him and killed him. There was slain the youth that had sanctified the divine name. He had done what no one else in Worms had. He killed 3 of the uncircumcised ones. Somewhat like David the Gabai, Simcha uses the fact that the Crusaders want him to convert to his advantage, saying that he will convert if the bishop is the one who performs the sacrament of baptism, but his actions are all premeditated here. He wanted to get in a place where he had only a few men to deal with, and as soon as he had a chance, he pulled his knife and killed 3 Crusaders, including the local bishop's nephew. Simcha was probably particularly angry at the bishop of Worms and his nephew because they were residents of the city, who he likely knew before the crusading mob arrived. And while several bishops in towns where Jews were massacred during these events tried to protect them, the bishop of Worms clearly did not. Instead, he decided to side with the Crusaders. The anonymous author of this chronicle even makes a point of saying what this young man did was exceptional and brave, and he of course still receives the title of martyr. The acts of these individuals were circulated in chronicles popular among Jews, and as a result, they all became pretty common ways for Jews to respond to future episodes of violence and forced conversion, which did become more common in the 12th and 13th centuries. Ultimately, thousands of Jews were slain along the Rhineland in 1096. The Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV did condemn these events, and he even put laws in place to keep such a thing from happening again. In fact, one of the leaders of the main crusade, named Godfrey of Bouillon, was planning an attack on Jews too, but Henry sent him a letter telling him if he did, he would have to deal with Henry. The papacy also condemned these attacks, though not with the same enthusiasm as Henry. It's also important to note that most chronicles about the First Crusade written by Christians condemn these attacks too. Ultimately, Emico's army would be stopped by the King of Hungary, whose land he marched through after leaving the Holy Roman Empire, and his men continued to loot and pillage, and this made the king angry. Most chroniclers attribute the ultimate failure of Emico's crusade to comeuppance for the horrible acts he took part in and led in the Rhineland. In short, it is important to temper our knowledge of these absolutely horrific events with the fact that most Christians viewed this as horrifying, and it wasn't the norm for this kind of thing to happen. In the end, it is worth noting that these attacks also did not utterly destroy the Jewish communities in the Rhineland, and life turned more or less back to normal for a while after this. We know this because of archaeological digs that reveal a Jewish presence in these cities in the 12th century and later. So that's an overview of the Rhineland massacres of the First Crusade and 3 different and very active ways that Jews responded to this outburst of violence and the threat of forced conversion. Some took the lives of their children and themselves, like Rachel. Others antagonized the Crusaders into killing them, like David the Gabai. And still others chose to try to violently take down as many Crusaders with them as they could, like Simcha HaKohen. Well, that does it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please like it and share it, because that means more people will be able to enjoy it. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to see more of my videos, including more on medieval Jewish-Christian relations, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.